Now, it's a fun thing when we start talking about people who were right in history and everyone else was wrong when they were listening to him. But it's even worse when you realise that someone was right and was being allowed about it and was being ignored because other people thought, well, you know, our political view of the world means you can't be right. No matter how much the evidence stacks up behind you, no matter how much the information you're putting forward behind you, you cannot be right. That's just next level. You know, there's one thing when people are absolutely, you know, not able to see the wood for the trees because of the information they're receiving and they don't see the right thing. But it's when they can see the correct information, when the person who's explaining, who's arguing outside, is right and he's obviously explaining using information and is the acknowledged expert in their field, and yet you're ignoring them and actually seeking to undermine them because of politics. And if you want a legacy to see how bad that is, just remember this. Every single person that died at Pearl Harbor, every single person who died at initial points of World War II, Japan's entry into the war, you can make the very solid case for happened because Richardson, James Otto Richardson, an admiral, commander of the US Navy, commander of its battle force, senior naval officer, protested against the deployment of the fleet to Pearl Harbor and protested that the US Navy and the government was willfully ignoring the Japanese and their capabilities and was willfully undervaluing them. A man who had been in charge of the US Navy's study of Japan, a man who had been in charge of War Plan Orange and various other things which of how to fight Japan. And by the way, the very methodology and strategy that Nimitz employs against Japan is the one which Richardson had conceived, because Nimitz knew how good Richardson was, as did King, and yet he's not listened to because politically it's not expedient. Because it's more important to be seen to be doing something than necessarily actually paying to do something. Deploying the fleet to Pearl Harbor, not strengthening Pearl Harbor, not properly fitting it out, leaving it as such a hardship posting. And I've had numerous comments on recent videos to this effect of, you know, the reason they had lax and they had, you know, the fact the treatment they got on a Saturday night, Sunday morning, and all these things, and left to go was because Pearl Harbor was such a hardship posting. They needed something to make the quality of life for the sailors better. Please listen to that and think it through. That was such a problem. Pearl Harbor, its laxity on a Sunday morning was such a problem that the Royal Navy had picked up on its occasional visits there. The US Navy had exploited it in their own exercises against Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese, of course, knew. And it's because Pearl Harbor's a hardship posting, and you've deployed the whole fleet there. And you haven't done anything about changing that situation. You haven't done anything to change that situation. You've just carried on with that culture, with having those issues. And by the way, in the face of repeated senior officers trying to change that situation, trying to either get the government to invest in Pearl Harbor or move the fleet back from Pearl Harbor, as it's a forward operating base as it's designed at the time and fitted out, not a frigating fleet base. So yes, all I can say is the fact that Richardson did not spend the entirety of 1942, 43, 44, 45, 46 and 47 walking around to every senior person in the US government while he was still serving, saying, "Loser!" and parading and gloating about the fact that they didn't listen to him, and look at what happened. It's because the man is a far better soul than many people ever have been, and probably because he still felt responsible for the fact that he hadn't managed to make them listen to him, and so therefore those people had died. And the sad thing is, because he's being so effective, and it's because he's being listened to, that Roosevelt goes so absolutely destructive on him. Think about that again. Not only is he right, not only do you know he's right, it's politically problematic, and because he's being so effective at communicating what is problematic in your policy, you have to go and absolutely try and destroy him. And by the way, that's what sets the seeds for what happens to Kimmel as well. Because everything has to be the naval officers' faults, because otherwise people have to start looking at above the naval officers and seeing who's been making decisions, who have they been reporting to. It's not a conspiracy theory that causes the attack on Pearl Harbor. No. It's far worse. It's negligence. It's wanton negligence and wanton politics run amok. That's it. That's it entirely. But let's look at this story of this particular admiral, James Otto Richardson. Rather appropriately for someone who would serve in the US Navy, Richardson was born in Paris, Texas, which is not quite the furthest you can get from the sea of anywhere in the United States, but is suitably landlocked. It's also one of the amazing truisms of the US Navy that almost every officer I've ever met who is from Texas or anywhere south of the Mason-Dixie line seems to come from the inland areas of America, not the coastal regions, and have joined the US Navy. I'm not saying this is true for everyone, it's just every single one I've met who fits that description has not been born anywhere near the coast. And he grows up. This is what his hometown looks like. You know, we have this wonderful picture, and it would be from when he was about 7 years old. It's from about 1885. And so, this is his world. He grows up as a Texan. He grows up happily being encouraged to learn, developing, and being encouraged to question authority. Being encouraged to question authority. This is one of the things that I've often found true whenever I've dealt with people from Texas, is that there is a strong vein in a Texan that they are not going to listen to you just because you are senior to them. You have to make a better argument than them. Now, occasionally in the bad ones, you have to make a louder argument than them because they rate the quality of argument by volume. And please note, I have Texas cousins, so I might be critiquing my own family here. I'm not saying if I am or not. But usually, it's the quality of argument, not the volume, that they go by, and they will give in to good argument, not to loud argument. Although it can get very loud. Oh, I've got to go out and visit those cousins someday. Now, he had served the US Navy from 1902 to 1947, so he is 24 when he finally joins the US Navy properly. He's been a cadet, he's done all the service, but yeah. He is properly in the US Navy by that point. He is well trained and capable of serving his navy, his nation. He actually joined Annapolis in 1898. So he done 4 years of US Navy Academy, graduating 5th in the class of 85. And then he almost immediately goes out to the Asiatic Squadron. He takes part in the Philippine campaign, and he does well. He does well, so much so that by 1907, the now Lieutenant Richardson is given his first commands. The torpedo boats Tingey and then Stockton. of the 3rd Division of the Atlantic Torpedo Flotilla, and this must have been a pretty fun experience for him. Now, the thing about these Blakely-class torpedo boats is that they're what America has at this point. Look, the US Navy, the German High Seas Fleet, all these sort of navies which are being built in many ways by politicians making grand statements but not backing them up with budgets for various reasons. In Germany, it's because the army goes, nope, that's our money. In America, it's because the Senate likes to make a lot of hot air about what they want to build Navy to be. And then when it comes to actually paying for it, every time they open their wallet, moths fly out rather than cash. Moths. This means you have forces which have a very good top line construction going on. Oh, we're constructing lots of good battleships. We are. But then you look down the list and you go, okay, where are your cruisers? And where are your destroyers? And do you have anything else? And it's a case of... which makes it kind of interesting, because that means for junior officers to get posted, especially the time as Richardson does, to command these boats is a bit of a prestigious assignment. It's a junior command position. It's a position where you're in command as a lieutenant. You get to command a torpedo boat. You get to lead your own crew. You get your own command experience. They don't give it out to everyone. So this is a massive statement of, this is how good this guy is. We like this guy. We think he's good quality. Admittedly, these particular vessels are armed with roughly 3 1-pounder guns, the original pom-pom, and 3 18-inch torpedo tubes. So, in terms of firepower, yeah, it's not massive. It's not massive, but between 1907 and 1909, they're what they are, and they are a good position for a junior officer to be given. They are a really good position for a junior officer to be given. And start to bring up his experience of command. But what happens next? After the torpedo boats, well, he's now had some leadership experience. What are they going to do with him next? Well, they send him to be in the 1st class of the US Navy's postgraduate engineering school, which he's there from 1909 to 1911. He's shown an aptitude for engineering. He's shown an aptitude for problem solving. It's very sensible. And then he goes to serve as an engineer on the USS Delaware, which he's on for really not a long time before he gets moved up to the staff of the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. Which might seem strange and like he's not a good engineer, but actually it's the reverse. He's a very good engineer, but they've just realised the quality of their reserve fleet and that they need it worked up for war. So they suddenly start to drag in as many of the engineering officers as they can to try and fix their reserve fleet. And some of the reserve fleet includes the very torpedo boats which he had up until recently been commanding. So it makes sense to grab him. He does find it annoying because he was rather enjoying trying to get BB-28 up to something approaching what he considered a proper speed. She's theoretically a 21-knot triple expansion engine ship, and that's where it should stay, but he was constantly trying to figure out how to get her up to a faster speed than 21 knots. One of the interesting things about Richardson is he is consistently one of the officers who is pushing that the standards and the US Navy's decision to anchor in on 21 knots for their battle line, which is the sensible strategic thing to do, to have a speed that you anchor in on, was too early and too low. He consistently was putting forward the argument it should have been higher than that. It should have been probably about 24 knots. And this seems to come from a fair number of officers in the US Navy at this time period. They are putting forward the argument that 21 knots is too low an anchor speed, a standard battle speed, and they should be pushing for faster. Now, there are reasons not to. If you're building engines which are about endurance, which is necessary for a Pacific campaign, And if you think about the fact that the American Congress especially tends to think about their navy in terms of defensive terms, so they don't think about their ships going and doing offensive action, they think about them defending, top speed might seem to not matter much. But the thing is, when you have a coast the size that America does have, and you have the commitments America does have, then speed assists you on a strategic level. Now, this is when I introduce you to one of the most fun and useful Excel spreadsheets I have. And pretty much every naval historian has it, because I'm going to explain to you why arguing about speed differentials and trying to get those extra knots, especially at lower speeds, matters. You see, the Delaware has a top speed of 21 knots. That's a cruising speed of 10 knots. And people like Richardson, when they're involved in this, particular ship, were always campaigning for more speed and better speed. Why? Because of this. And I welcome you to the world of geekiness that is the tables. The joyous tables. And you'll notice that my particular one, I have got some distances up here because I spent a lot of time working out particular travel distances. So I used New York to San Diego via the Panama Canal, Portsmouth to Singapore via the Suez Canal, San Diego to Honolulu, Alexandria to Singapore, and Portsmouth to New York. These are the sort of benchmark sort of times I want to work things out and I want to look things through. And specifically, if I'm looking at doing 10 knots, that's 10 nautical miles per hour, but 11.51 normal miles per hour, because there's a difference between a nautical mile and a regular mile. I can get from New York to San Diego via Panama Canal in 20 days, roughly. But if I'm doing 14 knots, that's 16.1 miles an hour, or 14 nautical miles an hour, and that gets me there in a little over 14.4 days. So that gets me there in roughly 2 weeks, rather than nearly 3 weeks. That's a big difference. And you see, the thing is, if I have a top speed of 21 knots, yes, I could get there in 9.6 days if I can keep it up for the whole time, because we're traveling at 24 miles per hour. If I've got a top speed of 24 knots, that gets me there at 8.4 days. So it gets me there about a day and a bit earlier. That's not really much help. However, the thing is, my top speed and my cruising speed are normally related, because I will, especially in this time period when I'm building triple expansion engines, or especially the early turbines where I might not have a cruising turbine and a regular turbine, I'm looking at what's the efficiency point of my turbine. So if I've designed a turbine to give me a speed of, let's say, 21 knots, what its efficiency point is going to probably be about 10, 11, 12 knots. Somewhere in that region. But if I make it 24 knots, then it's probably going to be 14 to 15 knots. So this is the point about speed. And the really advantage thing with the speed is here. The cruising speed. Okay, because the thing is, if you go from 21 to 24 knots, that's great for a battle. If you're fighting a battle at battle ranges, that gives you a 3-knot advantage over your 20-knot opponent, so you can decide battle ranges, you can decide engagement. That's really useful at that point. But let's be honest, in total speed increase, well, that's an extra 13.5-14% speed. But if your cruising speed increases from 10 knots to 14 knots, that's a 40% increase in speed. And that gives you a great advantage in strategic mobility, because, as you can see, if I am reinforcing and moving forces from New York to San Diego, or there or back again, I get there almost a week earlier. Suddenly, I have lowered my response time, my time to get my whole fleet together, from 3 weeks to 2 weeks. That matters. That is useful. If I can get it up any higher than that, that's going to be really, really useful. Really, really useful. And if we consider it for the British perspective, when they are talking about these things and looking at these cruising speeds of their fleets, one of the things that people often wonder is, why does the Royal Navy constantly work out on a cruising speed of roughly 18 knots? It's a very good cruising speed for the Royal Navy. Well, again, we'll consider the extent of the British scenario. If you're travelling from Portsmouth to Singapore via the Suez Canal, which is 8,072 nautical miles, and it's also roughly the same distance from Portsmouth to the Falkland Islands, believe it or not. Roughly the same distance. As going from Portsmouth to Singapore as going from Portsmouth to the Falkland Islands. Still roughly 8,000 nautical miles. Well, if you're travelling at 18 knots, you get to cover that distance in roughly 18 days. 18.7. If you're doing it at 10 knots, it's going to be 33.6 days. In simple terms, you're cutting 2 weeks off your travel time. 2 weeks off your travel time. If, as the British worked out, you could speed up the refueling by having refueling points along the way, which would be the local oilers, which could be slow, but they could come out from the various bases you have and fuel the ships as they're going past, so they didn't have to pull into the port, and then that oiler doesn't have to go and travel with them and slow them down. It can get pulled back in, and you can pull your fleet between these places as fast as you can physically can. So we're talking somewhere probably in the 25 knot range, 24, 25 knot range. Well, you can get from Portsmouth to Singapore in 14 days at 24 knots. 2 weeks. You can get from Alexandria to Singapore in 9 days at 24 knots. So, if you can do that, you can really get a fleet out there very quickly. And it's all about the strategic mobility argument. Working on the speed at the top end also tends to pull up the cruising speed. So, working out how to maximize your ship, how to maximize its efficiency, is useful. And it's going to be something which is going to come up further on in Richardson's career, because he actually, after the Delaware, and after he's working out in 1914, when he's promoted to rank of Lieutenant Commander, he's sent to the Department of the Navy's Bureau of Steam Engineering. And then he's put in charge of the Navy's fuel supply and working to make that reliable. He's a pretty useful officer at this point. But shameless book plug time. Now, this is going to be a bit of an interesting time, because normally I'm plugging my own book and I'm saying thank you for watching and supporting the channel and helping it grow. And I'm going to do a bit of that in the shameless book plug. A little bit, you know. This is my book. I've got others coming along, but this is the one that's currently out, published by Pen and Sword and USN. But I also want to plug another book. And I want to say it's worthwhile read, but you always have to remember it has been heavily redacted. And that is On the Treadmill to Pearl Harbor, the memoirs of Admiral James O. Richardson. Now, it was put together by George C. Dyer, working with Richardson. And Dyer is, of course, a naval officer. Richardson's a naval officer. The Kindle edition is £4 in the UK. Not sure how much the other editions are sort of worldwide. I have a paperback. I do have a paperback, and I have a Kindle version. The paperback is currently in a box still. The Kindle is on my phone. I will say this. The book is published in the UK. You find it by Books Express Publishing. It's basically being printed to order, and it was put together by the Department of the Navy of the United States. So it is a very, very simple book. And you have to do a fair chunk of reading between the lines. And by the way, you can get a beautifully bound hardcover version, which I know some people have, for roughly 50 quid. But I have the paperback somewhere in a box, and I have the Kindle. And it is worth a read. It is worth a read. But there is a wonderful quote from it, or rather the writing from it. Dyer wrote that he could attest that Richardson had an inexhaustible memory for facts, figures, and personalities, and I can tell you from reading it, he really did. He really did. And the rule was that the work would remain dormant until, well, a year before he died, and he had done this because he wanted it to be frank, but he didn't want to upset people like Admiral Stark, who he'd maintained a friendship with, despite sometimes having an interesting working relationship with throughout his life. You know, it was part of respect for them, but also he didn't really want to cause a battle while they were alive. But Richardson himself, his quote of it was, he regretted he burnt many of his diary pages, because since in the diary I had expressed frank and sometimes offhand opinions, some of them highly critical of various officers of the Navy and of officials of the governments for their actions or inactions during the 1939-41 period, I thought it best that the diary be burned. So I burned it, after extracting some non-critical parts. I also burned some of my personal letters and various naval communications, carrying my pithy comments, and boy does he love those. I highly recommend the work. I would say if you are interested in getting an idea on what's going on in America in that time, from someone who really knew what was going on, but not really massively interested in naval history specifically, go for the Kindle version. It's cheap. I would say if you're getting a book version, I would go for the paperback. The hardback is lovely, but it is so expensive that unless you are planning on using it as something you'll be reading constantly, and this is always the case I make with hardbacks or paperbacks, if it is something I am going to be opening and reading every 5 minutes and I want it to last because I'm going to be using it for years, non-stop like that, then I'll go for a hardback. If it's something which I'm going to be using as a reference guide occasionally, but not opening up daily and therefore putting through the work daily, then probably I can afford to save the money and go for the paperback and buy about 2 or 3 books for the same price as one hardback. So there you go. That's the rough rule of thumb. With that being said, let's get back to Richardson's pre-authoring career. Now, after his stint with the Bureau of Steam Engineering, he'd gone on to become the navigator and executive officer on the USS Nevada. A very nice battleship, thank you very much. Again, he complained about her speed. And then he was given a tour of assignment at Naval Academy. And finally, he's given his next command, the USS Asheville, in 1922. And he takes her out to command the South China Patrol. Yes, we're starting to see the benefit of his being interested in Asian affairs, because the South China Patrol is the Yangtze Patrol. And he goes out and commands that for 2 years. And that's 2 very important years. 1922 to 24. He's witnessing firsthand the impact of World War I and the impact of the Washington Naval Treaty on the Japanese and on the British and others. Now, he was a commander at this point, but by the time he returns home, he's captain. And when he does, he's sent to be assistant to the chief in the Bureau of Ordnance, which he serves in from 1924 to 27. And develops a lifelong loathing for them to an extent. But, you know, he gets to go off and work out his aggression, which has been suitably built up, by commanding a destroyer division. It's always nice to go and command a destroyer division after this. After you've been given all this opportunity, he goes off and commands a destroyer division. He has more experience, and then he has to return for the Bureau of Navigation and doing some service with them. His next command, that's the USS Augusta. And he gets her in January 1931, and she's brand new. He gets her to 1933 when he goes off to become a Naval War College student. And then he's put as a made budget officer at the Navy Department. And finally he gets promotion to Rear Admiral in December 1934. And in many ways what got him there was not just his experience so far, the various commands he'd be given, all these things. No, what got him there as quickly as he did was the fact he had written this. The year after Admiral King had done his thesis, which of course in 1933 is an excellent thesis, etc., Richardson writes this in 1934. It's worthwhile noting that there is one advantage to the American system where at this time where they promote officers as far as Rear Admiral, and then what their rank they have afterwards is entirely a brevet position, because you can promote based on who you want where. And there's a reason why Richardson gets command of the entire U.S. Navy. Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Forces, U.S. Navy, SINCUS. There's a reason he gets that. It's because he is in many ways the up-and-coming and very bright American strategist who understands Pacific War and understands the nature of war better than many others. And in his lovely, lovely work, and I do want to say lovely work, it's 18 pages, or broadly speaking, once you take out the title page, in fact the last page is roughly half page long, 16 and a half pages of text, and it has this on pages spread between pages 3 and 4, and it's beautiful because it sums up so much of what navies go through and the reality of why he was a perfect officer to, if they'd been listened to, for the position he was chosen for. In peace, the role of naval strategy is to so prepare the Navy for the support of national policy that other nations, whose policy may conflict with ours, will be loath to resort to war. Yet if war should unhappily eventuate, our Navy will be so prepared and so disposed, with properly equipped and adequately defended bases so located, as to enable it to attack successfully the vital trade routes of the enemy, while defending our own. It is the function of naval strategy, after knowing national policy of the state, to indicate. Now, one of the things I would say is, A, there are some interesting sentences which seem to stop short, and B, this is OCR recognition put across. Whilst extra full stops are a feature, those commas are literally what he puts in. I have tried to get rid of all the extra full stops. I think there's some in Army still, which I will just get rid of. Oh, goodness gracious me. But the thing is, all these systems, all these points, and these developments which he's putting forward are all about working with national policy. Working with the policy as enunciated by the government. That means that, therefore, though, that the government does need to actually have a policy which is enunciated and which can be followed. In peacetime, the 5 functions of naval strategy, especially, are the geographical position of bases to be acquired in peace or attained in war, the character and extent of defences and the facilities provided of such bases, the types including such characteristics as steaming radius and armament and numbers of ships, the personnel requirements, and 5, the character of the operations the fleet should be trained to undertake. One of the things you learn about this paper is it is full of questions. And that's really the right thing you need from a commander who's preparing a fleet for war. They need to have questions, and they need to be trying to seek answers for those questions, with exercises, with staff work, with intelligence gathering and information gathering, and all the things that need to be done. You want a commander in peacetime is preparing a force to war to be full of questions, full of uncertainty, full of adaptability, but full of questions, accepting nothing at face value and probing it deeply. In preparation for war, the character and extent of the war plans to be formulated for the conduct of any war that might be necessary to secure the objectives of national policy. The type and number of fleet auxiliary ships that should be provided. The amount and character of joint operations to be provided for, i.e. amphibious operations. Those are major joint operations which they're thinking about in terms of naval strategy. The geographical distribution of the fleet, i.e. not just the bases but where the ships are. And that's in preparation for war. If you think war's imminent, where are your ships going to be positioned? Where should they be positioned? What should they be doing? How should they be organised? And then in war, in the area of operations, the objectives of the Navy, the operations to be initiated, the time and purpose of the battle, the reserves in personnel and material to be assembled, the naval building program to be initiated. The fact that he honestly puts the fact that naval building program to be initiated is part of the war. It's not part of the peace, it's not part of the preparation, it's part of the war. To be honest, that's an understanding of the Anglo-American approach to naval warfare, which is frankly disturbing but very accurate. That if in doubt, they will be doing the building once war has been initiated. Thus, while the army strategy begins only with the outbreak of war, naval strategy is not a strictly military problem, and begins in time of peace. It is so intimately connected with, and flows so directly from national policy, that it is a joint problem of the naval leaders and the statesmen. A large part of the work of strategy should be completed before war begins. Now, it's not quite so a ringing indictment of democratic leadership as Admiral King's 1933 thesis is. Honestly, that is a thesis and a half if you want to be dealing with a politician. But it does sound quite a lot of death knells, in a far more politer tone. I think in many ways, Roosevelt was lucky to have Richardson in the position he was than King, because Richardson, as you can tell from this linguistics, is bending over backwards to guide people through the policy without calling anyone stupid. He's trying to make it as functionally naval strategy by numbers as physically possible. And it goes through the entire work like this. And I have to applaud him for being able to explain strategy in such a manner. It's very modern in its terms of discussion. In fact, the thing is, I first learnt about Admiral Richardson. The first time I found myself teaching his testimony was actually this thesis. And then I looked him up afterwards. And the reason I was teaching from it was I was using his... It was given to me as notes from someone who had already taught a course, and I was teaching a module of the seminar the following year, the lecture the seminar the following year, and it was on conflict management theory and deterrence theory in conventional deterrence theory from the interwar years. And they gave me a quote from Richardson's thesis, not this one. Not this particular passage, you get another passage in it. I preferred this one. I followed the link to it, found the website with the relationships in war of naval strategy, tactics and command, and went, ooh, that's an interesting read, went through it all. And it was only after I got the quote out I thought, you know what, I better look up this guy, because my luck when teaching him is I'm going to rattle off his quote, rattle off his thesis, and then someone's going to ask me, what did he do? And so that's when I went and studied him. And it just flew out the page of me as going, oh frigate! Oh frigate! This guy was right. And people weren't just not listening to him, they knew he was right, and they were actively trying to undermine him because it would cause them political issues. And that just annoyed me. I think it made me give a better lecture in the end because I was so annoyed about on Richardson's behalf. But it did annoy me. Anyway, with all this study behind it, all this experience behind him, all this hard work and these glowing reports and his constantly being asked to do difficult assignments, let's be honest, getting the Yangtze Patrol, that's not an easy assignment. Getting records to try and turn the US Navy into a reserve fleet into a functioning force for World War One, that's not an easy assignment. All this behind him, well, in 1934, he's made a Rear Admiral. He's made a Rear Admiral. The position he was serving in at a time when he was made a Rear Admiral was he was a budget officer in the Navy Department. Yes, that's where they'd sent this person after Naval War College. They'd send him to be a budget officer. And then, after that, well, he's given a cruiser division in the scouting force, serving as aide and chief of staff to Admiral J.M. Bull Reeves. Good position and experience, definitely. Commander of destroyers in the scouting force for a tour. Assistant Chief Naval Officer to Leahy in June 1937. Conducting the Washington part of the search for Amelia Earhart. And dealing with the fallout from the attack on the USS Panay. And then he became Chief of the Bureau of Navigation. Finally, in 1938, he, along with the Major General, Stanley Embrick, compiled the up-to-date War Plan Orange. The military plans for war against Japan. That's his work. He provides the best, fullest, most up-to-date version of this in 1938 to 1939. And that is a suitable usage of such a guy. That really is. It's such a useful use of him. But we're not doing his full career because, well, after this, sensibly, they decide we've got a difficult task. We have to manage Japan. War is going on in the world. Well, coming into the world. It's June 1939. We have to deploy someone who's capable of preparing a fleet for war, to command our fleet, to be Commander Battle Force US Fleet, to be Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet by January 1940. That will be Richardson. And that's a role he serves in till February 1941. And this is the role which brings him into pretty much open warfare with one Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, he starts off this period of service with his fleet based in San Diego. That is where his navy is. He's the senior seagoing naval officer of the United States Fleet. He is ranked as an admiral. Yes, it's a brevet promotion contingent on him being in the role, but he is ranked as an admiral. He has been chosen for this role as probably the foremost serving strategist in the US Navy and the foremost expert on Japan and Japanese strategy and Japanese way of war in the US Navy at the time. And he is chosen for all these things to prepare the fleet. And suddenly, in 1940, after taking his fleet to Hawaii for an exercise, he is ordered to stay there. because without consulting a single naval officer, without consulting a single member of the armed forces, Roosevelt and his Secretary of State decide between them that if they stationed a fleet in Hawaii, that would restrain the Japanese. The Hawaiian naval base at this point was nowhere near structured for supporting the fleet for a long-term operation. It was pretty much a waypoint, an exercise point. It was a point you turned up to. You stayed at for a short time. That was one of the reasons why the issues in culture at Hawaii had become prevalent, because it was, to an extent, a holiday posting. Yes, it's a hardship, but you're not there for long term. It's a holiday posting. It's a short-term posting, and we have a party while we're there. We'll get to let our hair down a bit. Now, the thing is, Richardson does believe that such advanced bases, such as Hawaii, such as Guam, are necessary. But his argument and protests to Roosevelt, using the intelligence he's being given, because as the foremost expert on Japan, they send him all the information because he knows what he's talking about, and he's a full admiral and will have arguments with people if they don't send him the full information, and he wins them quite handily. He puts forward the argument that whilst the advanced bases are necessary, they have had insufficient funding and efforts have yet to be made to prepare them for use in wartime. In simple terms, if we go back to his strategy paper, they are failing to fulfill the requirements of both peace and preparation for war. Geographical position of bases to be acquired in peace or attained in war. Yeah, that's there. And in preparation for war. Well, it's not just a geographical disposition of fleets, but it's also the bases. How well are they protected? How well they are going to work, and how well they support it. All these things need to be done. And he knows this. He's quite literally written the book about it. He's quite literally written the US Navy's book on Japan. And he keeps arguing and keeps arguing. And he makes a lot of very valid, very scary points for the government. And what's worse is, his main argument tends to boil down to, look, give it time, actually build the logistics, build the infrastructure, build the things we need here. In the meantime, I'll return to San Diego the fleet, I will supervise the construction, and once it's ready, I will bring the fleet back here. We'll be back as soon as we can. Just give me the constructors, give me the engineers, give me the frigating Seabees. He'd love Seabees. Let me do this work necessary to make these places up to standard. He actually causes so much noise, he travels twice to Washington to meet with Roosevelt in person and argue them. He would follow up each meeting with official letters to the CNO, Admiral Clarke, pointing out very firmly the conviction that he was arguing from a lot of solid evidence that neither the Navy nor the country was prepared for war with Japan and or Germany. That it wasn't prepared for war and wasn't preparing for war. The second visit took place in October 1940. And after it, the White House did that wonderful thing White Houses do. They leaked to the Washington-based Kipling the newsletter predicting Richardson will be removed as fleet commander. In fact, the reason they do this is because Richardson had told Roosevelt, the senior officers of the Navy do not have the trust and confidence of civilian leadership of this country that is essential for successful prosecution of war in the Pacific. He told him that when asked by the president why he didn't trust the president's positioning him in Pearl Harbor. Pretty much. Basically, Roosevelt said, well, I think you need to be there, so, why don't you trust me on my assessment? We don't trust you. You don't know what you're talking about, and you haven't prepared us. You haven't supplied us with money, the funds, everything we need for this sort of thing. And they get rid of him in a really nasty way. A really nasty way. Because it had been strongly suspected that he would be promoted to Chief Naval Officer to replace Stark. And that would have been a good choice. Again, a very capable officer. He would have argued with Roosevelt the whole time, but he'd been preparing the Navy while doing it. He wouldn't have had a lot of the issues. And it probably wouldn't have ended up having to have King come in and take over, as he does, if Richardson had been there, which does give us a whole interesting scenario of King being a free option to potentially go take over the Pacific Fleet instead of Nimitz, and all sorts of fun things can happen in that scenario. But he doesn't, because he argues too honestly with them. And so, in 1st of February 1941, General Order 143 is issued. It reorganizes the USN as a whole. It changes it to the US Atlantic Fleet and US Pacific Fleet, each with their own Commander-in-Chief. Richardson is replaced by Kimmel as the new Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and King becomes Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet. Sincus as a position is effectively dismissed, but theoretically Kimmel holds it until it's passed to King after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And, well, Roosevelt had won his way. Richardson is reverted to permanent rank of Rear Admiral, serves as a member of the Navy General Board, and in the office of Secretary of Navy until he would retire October the 1st, 1942. Now, he takes that. He takes that with kindness in his heart, because what he does is he carries on fighting for the Navy's corner. And when in October 1942 he does retire, he is given the rank of full admiral on his retirement list, and manages to carry on working with the Naval Relief Society as a senior member of the Special Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee, which is in charge of reorganizing national defense, and was one of the first witnesses to be called before the Congressional Committee on Pearl Harbor, and served as a witness on the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. He did all these things. He did all of them, and he did well. His testimony was interesting in that it becomes the focus of especially the minority opinion and the minority report on Pearl Harbor. You see, what worried a fair number of people at the time was that it had been very easy for Roosevelt to show that he hadn't tricked, provoked, incited, cajoled, or coerced Japan into attacking the United States. Because he really hadn't. But no one was asking the question was, had they instead made a stupid decision, put our forces in a position which they shouldn't have been, invited attack through that stupidity, and therefore led to this decision? You see, that's the thing. If you're looking for someone to have purposefully set the situation, wanted for there to be a war, you can't find evidence for that, and you won't find evidence for that. Because that's not what they were doing. They weren't being malicious, they were being stupid. They weren't being, how do I put this, overly aggressive. They weren't listening to their own senior officers. They were ignoring them. because they thought they knew better. You see, the approach of a large amount of the American establishment to Japan as a threat was that they weren't a threat. That they were so much smaller, so much less capable, that they could never do anything to them, and they would never dare do anything to them. And unfortunately, that level of confidence can lead you to having issues. It really can. When that belief is combined with a level of willful ignorance on the part of the political class, you have real troubles. Now, there are many sections of Richardson's testimony towards Congress in the Pearl Harbor Committee that I could point to, and I could discuss with reference to Pearl Harbor. But there is a particularly interesting section that I want to talk to about his cross-examination by the chairman. And for those wanting to look it up, this is roughly 734, 736 in what is volume number 1 of the Pearl Harbor hearings. And yes, I do have the PDF here. It's far easier than having the full book. Now, the chairman asks this question. Chairman, Admiral, who was your immediate predecessor as commander of the United States fleet? Admiral Richardson. I relieved Admiral Claude C. Block. Chairman, what is the technical relationship between the commander-in-chief of the fleet, such as what you were, which you were commander of, and the commandant of the 14th Naval District? Admiral Richardson. The commandant of the 14th Naval District is a subordinate of the commander-in-chief. He is also under the chief of naval operations with respect to other than fleet matters. The chairman. When the fleet is at sea, does the commandant of the 14th Naval District have complete authority within the district, or is he still subject to orders of the commander-in-chief of the fleet? Admiral Richardson. He is always subject to the orders of the Commander-in-Chief, because the Commander-in-Chief may not be present in Pearl Harbor. He is the representative of the Commander-in-Chief in dealings with the Commanding General. The Chairman. Yes. Now, up to the time when you were detached, the force of which you Commander-in-Chief was known as the United States Fleet. Is that true? Admiral Richardson. That is correct, because at the time, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet had command of all the ships in the Atlantic that were in commission and not operating directly under the Chief of Naval Operations, as a ship would be where she undergoing shakedown preparatory to joining the fleet. The Chairman. So that during the time when you were Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, that meant that you were in command, the Commander-in-Chief of the entire fleet? Admiral Richardson. That is true. Mentally going, and you're a congressman who's supposed to have been in charge of us at the time. Okay. Chairman, no matter where it was located? And Richardson, that is true. The Chairman, now, there was a reorganization that was somewhat coincident with your detachment? And Richardson, absolutely coincident. Tower has moved, but he doesn't have that bit. The Chairman, and they divided the fleet into the Pacific Fleet and the Asiatic Fleet? And Richardson, no. The Chairman, no. And Richardson. There have always been a small force known as the Asiatic Fleet. That was not under the command of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, but passed under his command in the case the United States Fleet moved to the Western Pacific. The Chairman. Well, on the 1st of February then, 1941, approximately the Pacific Fleet as such came into existence? And Richardson. It did. The title and position of Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet disappeared, and in lieu thereof there was established the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, which commanded all the ships in the Pacific Ocean that were not part of the Asiatic Fleet, and were not operating directly under the Chief of Naval Operations. There was a Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, who commanded all the combatant ships in commission in the Atlantic Fleet, except those that were operating directly under the Chief of Naval Operations. The Chairman. When did he become Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet? Admiral Richardson. On January 6th, 1940. Chairman, so that you were in command of the fleet approximately 30 months. Richardson, that is correct. The Chairman, was Admiral Kimmel associated with the fleet under your command in the Pacific? Richardson, he was. He was in the fleet under command of, or the immediate senior under Admiral Stark, before I became Commander-in-Chief and before Admiral Stark became Chief of Naval Operations. In fact, he relieved Admiral Stark as commander of the cruisers, and from that position he relieved me. The Chairman, what relationship did he occupy in authority with respect to you as the Commander-in-Chief of the fleet? Was he senior officer under you, or how far down the line did he go? Admiral Kimmel? This was from Admiral Richardson. Admiral. Chairman, yes. Admiral Richardson. Well, he was very far down. He was a rear admiral, and under me came first the commander of the battle force, who was an admiral, the commander of the scouting force, and commander of the battleships, who were both vice admirals. Then Admiral Kimmel commanded the cruisers, and as such, he was on the same level as the commander of the battleships, the commander of the destroyers, and the commander of the aircraft. And the chairman. And he was commander of all the cruisers then in the force? Admiral Richardson. Yes, that what we call a type commander. The chairman. Yes. Now, in this correspondence between Admiral Stark and you continuously emphasized your belief that the fleet should be based on the Pacific coast rather than Hawaii Islands or Oahu? Or Oahu? Admiral Richardson, I did that. And I'm not going to carry on. It is one of the most depressing things to read through. Because you're the chairman of the Pearl Harbor Committee. And you have no understanding of the Navy or Army, Armed Forces you're investigating. You haven't gone off and done any research. And yes, you could say, well, yes, he's got to ask these questions to clarify these points, but there's a way they could be asked if you have knowledge of the event. You go, can you please confirm if this statement is true? Can you please confirm if this statement is true? Da-da-da-da-da. Rather than the way he is asking it. And ultimately, this is probably where King succeeds while Richardson doesn't. Because Richardson argues in a system where he believes, to an extent, that the politicians in Washington must be seeing something he isn't. And so whilst he disagrees with them on naval grounds, because they're pushing it from political grounds, he won't make it public. Because he trusts the democratic system. King really doesn't trust that the people in charge know what they're doing. He knows they're elected, he will follow their orders, it's part of the system. But he doesn't trust they know what they're doing. At all. And that's ultimately the difference between them. But here is the question I want to put with you. I want you to think Richardson does end up as Chief of Naval Operations. And therefore, it is King who replaces Kimmel after Pearl Harbor. And Nimitz goes out to be one of King's task force commanders. How does World War II in the Pacific develop? I'd be really interested to hear what you think. Really interested. With that being said, what we've got coming next week. This one will go out, and it's the Battle of Gravelines. Oh, that's going to be a fun one. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and take care. Hope you enjoyed.